It was meant to be a quiet, private family moment, no cameras, no press, no expectations. But what happened behind those palace walls would send shockwaves through the monarchy. A young prince, barely old enough to understand legacy, asked a question so piercing it broke centuries of royal composure. And for the first time in living memory, King Charles, Britain's sovereign, was left utterly speechless and in tears. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. There were no courtiers hovering, no aides scribbling notes, no carefully choreographed smiles, just family, just blood. The kind of gathering the public imagines happens all the time inside royal residences, but rarely does. The atmosphere was subdued, almost reflective, as though the weight of history pressed gently against the windows. Conversations drifted between polite laughter and thoughtful pauses. And in the middle of it all sat Prince Louis Young, restless, watching far more than anyone realized. He was never meant to be the center of gravity in that room. The youngest often isn't, but Louis has always carried a spark and observant stillness behind the mischief, a gaze that lingers a second too long. That night he seemed unusually quiet, listening, measuring. Adults often forget how much children absorb when they believe no one is paying attention. Yet Louis had been paying attention for years to hushed headlines, to strained silences, to the unspoken ache that clung to certain names. The shift began subtly, a lull in conversation, a glance exchanged between senior royals that lingered too long, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels loaded. And then, without ceremony, without awareness of the centuries of restraint wrapped around the crown, Louis asked it, a question so simple in wording, so devastating in implication, that it sliced clean through royal protocol. Why does our family look sad when we're supposed to be strong? It was not shouted, it was not accusatory, it was curious, innocent. But in that innocence was truth raw and unfiltered. The room froze, because this was not merely a child wondering about emotions. It was a mirror held up to generations of repression, expectation, and carefully maintained dignity. It was the voice of a new era, asking why strength must always look like silence. King Charles, a man trained since childhood to master composure, felt the words land with startling force. He had endured public scrutiny, personal scandal, heartbreak broadcast to the world. He had stood firm through grief that reshaped the monarchy itself, yet nothing had prepared him for this unguarded confrontation from his own grandson. In that moment, the sovereign was not a king. He was a father, a grandfather, a man carrying decades of complicated memory. Those present would later describe a stillness unlike anything they had witnessed. Not scandal, not anger, something deeper. Charles' expression shifted not dramatically, but unmistakably. The carefully practiced reserve faltered. His voice, when he tried to respond, caught in his throat. Because Louis' question did not just ask about sadness, it asked about wounds, about Diana, about Harry, about the fractures that polite statements could never fully mend. And as emotions surfaced, real, unscripted emotion, palace insiders understood they were witnessing something no briefing document could prepare them for. This was not a public relations challenge. This was generational reckoning. A child had unknowingly stepped into the fault lines of the House of Windsor and illuminated them with brutal clarity. What made it haunting was not the tears themselves. It was what they signified. For decades, the monarchy survived by presenting unbreakable strength. But in that private room, strength looked different. It looked fragile. It looked human. And once that humanity revealed itself, even briefly, it could never be fully concealed again. Because Louis' question was not confined to that evening. It lingered, it echoed. It exposed how the past continues to breathe inside the present. And those who heard it knew this was more than a tender family exchange. It was a signal, a quiet warning that the next generation will not inherit silence without questioning its cost. But to understand why this single question carried such devastating weight, we must go back to the fractures hidden deep within the royal family itself. For decades, the monarchy has perfected the art of illusion, smiles, waves, unity. But behind the palace gates lies a story far more complicated. One of quiet betrayals, unresolved grief, and emotional distance that spans generations. Long before Prince Louis ever spoke, the foundation of the royal family had already begun to fracture. And those cracks were waiting for the right moment to break wide open. To understand the depth of that fracture, you have to look beyond ceremonies and state banquets, and into the silent spaces where affection was often replaced with obligation. The House of Windsor was built on endurance, not emotional fluency. Strength meant composure, vulnerability was indulgence. From a young age, Charles was shaped by that philosophy, sent away to school despite his sensitivities, urged to suppress tears, reminded that one day he would be king. His childhood was less about comfort and more about conditioning. Duty came first, feelings came later, if at all. That upbringing did not harden him overnight. It worked slowly, like water carving stone. Over time, Charles learned to tuck disappointment behind polite smiles, to bury longing beneath speeches about service. Affection was formal, praise was rare, even love felt measured, and though the public saw a privileged heir, what developed beneath the surface was a man who understood responsibility intimately, but struggled to express emotional ease. This was not cruelty. It was tradition, a tradition that valued stoicism as survival. Then came Diana. Her arrival disrupted more than headlines. It disrupted emotional equilibrium. She brought warmth that felt unscripted, spontaneity that did not consult protocol. Where the institution demanded distance, she offered closeness. She hugged her sons in public. She spoke openly about pain, and in doing so, she exposed the monarchy's emotional limitations to the world. Her marriage to Charles became more than a personal struggle. It became a collision between two philosophies: duty versus vulnerability. When that union fractured, it did not simply end a relationship. It deepened fault lines that were already running through the family's core. Her death sealed those cracks with grief that was never fully resolved. The image of two young princes walking behind their mother's coffin etched itself into national memory, but what lingered inside palace walls was heavier: unspoken sorrow, regret, the sense that something precious had been misunderstood until it was too late. Charles carried that weight quietly. William carried it differently. And Harry, well, his path would later reveal just how deep the wounds truly ran. As William grew into fatherhood, something shifted. He had been raised within the same rigid structure, yet he had also experienced its consequences. Determined not to repeat history, he chose a different tone with his own children. More hands-on, more emotionally present. He knelt to speak at eye level. He listened. He allowed laughter to interrupt formality. It was sub-20 rebellion, but rebellion nonetheless. A future king, redefining strength not as silence, but as connection. This contrast did not go unnoticed inside the family. The older generation maintained its composed rhythm. The younger introduced softer edges. Tradition versus transformation, ceremony versus candor, and in that quiet tension, children like Louis were growing up, absorbing everything: the pauses in conversation, the careful wording around certain topics, the names that altered the mood when spoken aloud. Children notice patterns adults assume are invisible. They sense when smiles are practiced. They recognize when grief lingers in the corners of a room. Louis, though young, was born into an atmosphere shaped by history, by Diana's absence, by Charles's restraint, by William's determination to do better. He inherited not just a title's proximity, but an emotional legacy still negotiating itself. So when he eventually asked that piercing question, it was not formed in isolation. It was shaped by years of quiet observation, by witnessing moments when traditions seemed to weigh heavier than joy, by feeling the subtle push and pull between what the monarchy has always been and what it is struggling to become. His words carried the echo of generations of stoic kings, silenced pain, and a mother whose warmth once challenged the system itself. And it was precisely this clash between tradition and emotional truth that set the stage for Louis' unforgettable and devastating question. The room fell quiet. Conversations faded into whispers. What started as a simple exchange between grandfather and grandson suddenly shifted into something far deeper, something raw. Prince Louis, with disarming innocence, looked directly at King Charles and asked a question no one in that room was prepared to hear. In that instant, time seemed to stop, and the weight of history came crashing down. It did not begin as confrontation. It began as curiosity. Louis had been listening, his small voice occasionally weaving into the adult cadence of careful conversation. Charles had leaned in, patient, attentive in the way grandfathers often are when the world outside no longer demands their full command. There was a softness to the exchange at first, a generational bridge. But then something shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible. A pause that lingered too long, a look from the child that held more thought than expected. Louis did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply asked, directly, clearly, with the kind of unfiltered honesty that only a child can summon. The words themselves were not shouted, yet they landed with startling force. They carried the quiet gravity of everything unsaid in that family for decades. It was a question shaped by observation, not rebellion. And that is what made it devastating. For a fraction of a second, Charles did not react at all. His posture stiffened, barely noticeable, but enough. The practiced composure of a monarch flickered. His eyes, so accustomed to measured expression, widened with something closer to disbelief. Not anger, not irritation, something far more fragile. He had faced political storms, constitutional debates, public criticism that spanned half a century, but this gentle inquiry from his grandson had slipped past every defense. Around them, the air tightened. Family members who moments earlier had been speaking freely fell into uneasy stillness. Glances were exchanged, quick and uncertain. No one intervened. No one knew how, because there is no protocol for a child articulating what generations have worked tirelessly to conceal. There is no royal script for responding to emotional truth spoken without agenda. Louis's tone had not wavered. It was steady, almost thoughtful. He was not challenging authority. He was trying to understand it. Why certain topics dimmed the mood. Why strength often looked like sorrow. Why smiles sometimes seemed rehearsed. His question, simple in structure, cut through decades of conditioning that had taught the Windsors to endure quietly, to process privately, to present unity at all costs. Charles opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. That hesitation said more than any speech could. In that brief silence, the sovereign and the man collided. The crown demands resilience. The grandfather felt exposed, and as the weight of memory pressed in Diana's shadow, estranged sons, public expectations that never soften his control began to slip, not dramatically, not theatrically, but unmistakably. His voice, when it finally emerged, carried strain. Words formed slowly, carefully, as though each syllable required negotiation between pride and pain. The room did not move. It felt suspended in something larger than a family conversation. It felt like reckoning, because Louis had not just asked about a feeling, he had illuminated a pattern, one that stretched back to Charles's own childhood, to lessons in stoicism, that left little room for emotional fluency. What stunned those present was not merely the vulnerability on Charles's face. It was the realization that the youngest voice in the room had identified what the oldest traditions had failed to address. A child had pierced the armor of monarchy with nothing but sincerity. And once that armor cracked, even slightly, it revealed how thin it had become. The emotional shift was undeniable. Charles was no longer responding as king, but as a man forced to confront the cost of inherited restraint. The carefully maintained balance between duty and feeling trembled. And in that trembling, the family glimpsed something rare, honesty unfiltered by institution. But what exactly did Louis see or feel? That led him to ask something so deeply unsettling. Children don't understand politics. They don't care about protocol. But they see everything, and sometimes their questions reveal truths that adults spend lifetimes avoiding. Prince Louis wasn't trying to challenge the monarchy. He was trying to understand it. And in doing so, he may have uncovered something far more powerful than anyone realized, a truth hidden in plain sight. There is a quiet intelligence in children that often goes underestimated. They read tone before they understand its titles. They sense tension before they grasp its cause. Louis, growing up within palace walls, has been surrounded by ceremony and tradition, but also by something far more subtle, emotional undercurrents that ripple beneath polished appearances. He has watched the smiles offered to crowds. He has heard the measured responses crafted for public reassurance. And perhaps without realizing it, he has compared those moments to the softer, more complicated reality of family life behind closed doors. The monarchy has long depended on image, unity, strength, stability. It is a structure built on the belief that perception can protect it. But perception requires control, and control often demands restraint. Within that restraint lies distance. Louis may not understand constitutional roles or historical disputes, but he understands when a room shifts after a certain name is spoken. He understands when laughter feels forced. He understands when someone is present, yet emotionally elsewhere. And it is in that gap between presence and connection that his question was born. What Louis may have sensed in Charles was not weakness, but weariness. A lifetime of measured responses can create a barrier that even family struggles to cross. Charles has carried duty like armor for decades. Armor protects, but it also isolates. To a child who craves authenticity, that distance can feel confusing. Why does someone so admired sometimes seem so burdened? Why does strength appear so heavy? Louis' question did not rise from defiance. It rose from empathy, from noticing that behind the authority, there was something unresolved. Children are often drawn to emotional inconsistencies. They try to reconcile what they feel with what they are told. Publicly, the monarchy projects certainty. Privately, it has endured loss, estrangement, and unspoken regret. Louis stands at the intersection of those realities, old enough to sense them, young enough to ask about them, without fear. In many ways, he represents something quietly revolutionary. A generation raised not solely on stoicism, but on conversation. William and Catherine have encouraged openness, fostering emotional vocabulary where previous eras enforced silence. That shift matters. It means Louis is growing up in a household where questions are not discouraged, where feelings are not liabilities, and when that mindset meets the older traditions of royal restraint, friction is inevitable. His curiosity reflects more than personal concern. It reflects generational change pressing gently but persistently against ancient structures. The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, scandals, but emotional evolution is a different kind of challenge. It cannot be managed with strategy alone. It demands introspection. And when a child articulates what others have quietly endured, it forces reflection that cannot easily be dismissed. Louis may not realize the magnitude of what he touched. To him, it was likely a simple attempt to understand his grandfather, but in asking, he exposed the fragile balance between legacy and humanity. He revealed that even within institutions built on continuity, the next generation will question inherited silence. They will seek clarity over ceremony. And for King Charles, that question didn't just echo in the room, it reopened wounds he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. To the world, King Charles is a symbol of continuity, tradition, and unwavering strength. But beneath the crown lies a man shaped by loss, expectation, and emotional restraint. And in that moment when Prince Louis asked his question, those carefully built walls began to crumble. What followed wasn't just surprising. It was something no monarch had ever allowed the world to see. From the time he could walk, Charles was trained not simply to live, but to endure, every gesture measured, every word weighed, affection filtered through formality. He learned early that the monarchy survives through composure, not confession. Tears were private. Doubt was weakness. Even joy was moderated by the knowledge that one day he would carry the weight of a nation. That burden does not disappear with age. It calcifies. It becomes instinct. Yet beneath that instinct lived a boy who once longed for reassurance, for warmth unbound by duty. That longing never fully vanished. It was simply buried beneath decades of obligation. When Diana entered his life, she disrupted that careful emotional architecture. She was expressive where he was reserved, intuitive where he was conditioned. Their love story, once celebrated, slowly became a battlefield of unmet needs and incompatible worlds. And when it fractured, the rupture was not only marital, it was deeply personal. Her death carved something permanent into him. Grief, magnified by public scrutiny, regret, complicated by history, the haunting awareness that what was unresolved could never be repaired. Charles carried that sorrow silently, even as cameras searched his face for weakness. He stood firm for his sons, for the crown, for the institution. But grief does not dissolve simply because it is managed. It lingers in quiet moments. It were Ezeuphas's when least expected. So when Lewis asked his question so innocent, so piercing, it did not land on neutral ground. It struck layers of memory Charles had spent years compartmentalizing. In that instant, he was no longer just the sovereign responding to a child. He was a father remembering two boys walking behind their mother's coffin, a husband recalling arguments that never found resolution, a son shaped by parents who valued stoicism over solace. The crown and the man collided. His internal conflict was visible in the smallest details, a tightening of breath, a pause too long to ignore. The king understood that strength requires steadiness. The grandfather felt the sting of truth in his grandson's voice. For a heartbeat, he seemed suspended between two identities, answer with protocol or answer with honesty. And then it happened. The composure faltered, not dramatically, not theatrically, but unmistakably. His eyes glistened, his voice wavered. It was subtle, yet seismic, because monarchs do not cry, not publicly, not visibly. They carry on. That is the unspoken rule. Yet here was Charles, decades into preparation for this very role, unable to fully contain the emotion rising within him. Those present felt it immediately. Palace staff, accustomed to controlled environments and measured reactions, were stunned into stillness. This was not a rehearsed address or a managed statement. This was unguarded humanity, the kind that cannot be scripted, the kind that reveals the cost of lifelong restraint. In allowing those tears to surface even briefly, Charles crossed an invisible threshold. He did not abandon duty. He did not renounce tradition, but he allowed vulnerability to coexist with authority. And that coexistence felt revolutionary within a system built on emotional discipline. It suggested that strength might not lie solely in suppression, but in acknowledging it meant. For Charles, it may have been a deeply personal reckoning, a recognition that inherited silence had shaped him, but did not have to define the future. A realization that the next generation is watching not only how he leads, but how he feels. That moment, fragile and unscripted, hinted at transformation, not of the monarchy's structure, perhaps, but of its emotional language. But while Charles wrestled with his emotions, others in the room began to realize this moment could change everything. What happens when the most powerful family in the world is confronted with a truth they can't control? As the shock of Prince Louis's question spread through the room, the reactions weren't just emotional, they were revealing. Behind every glance, every silence, was a story. And in that moment, the carefully balanced dynamics of the royal family began to shift. In ways no one could predict, William felt it instantly. Not just the weight of his son's words, but the weight of what they had stirred in his father. Protective instinct surged first, an almost reflexive urge to shield Louis from the intensity of the silence that followed. Yet beneath that instinct was something more complicated: recognition. Because William understood the emotional terrain his son had unknowingly stepped into. He had walked it himself as a child, navigating grief beneath flashing cameras, learning composure before fully understanding loss. Watching Charles falter, even slightly, stirred both empathy and unease within him. He glanced at his father, searching for steadiness, then at his son, searching for innocence. In that space between generations, William stood as both bridge and barrier. He had chosen a different path in raising his children: more openness, more emotional vocabulary, but he was still heir to an institution that survives on control. And now those two realities were colliding in real time. Support his father's authority, or affirm his son's honesty. The tension did not need words. It pulsed quietly beneath his calm exterior. Catherine remained composed, as she so often does, yet composure does not mean indifference. She has long understood the delicate equilibrium of this family, the way a single moment can ripple outward into narrative, speculation, consequence. Her expression remained steady, but her attention sharpened. She knew Louis had spoken from sincerity, not defiance, and she also knew that sincerity can be destabilizing in a system built on discretion. Her presence in that moment was grounding, a silent assurance to her child that curiosity is not a crime, even when it unsettles power. Other family members absorbed the shift with varying degrees of discomfort. Some looked toward Charles, measuring whether the king would reclaim control of the atmosphere. Others avoided eye contact entirely, as if acknowledging the vulnerability would make it too real. There were those who felt sympathy and those who felt alarm, because emotional transparency within the monarchy is not merely personal. It carries institutional implications. The divide was subtle but unmistakable. The older generation, shaped by decades of discipline, leaned toward restoration, return the conversation to safer ground, re-establish the familiar rhythm. The younger generation seemed more contemplative, less eager to smooth over the rawness. They had grown up in a world that values authenticity over austerity. For them, the moment felt less like a breach and more like a breakthrough. What became clear in those charged minutes was that Louis's question had exposed more than Charles's vulnerability. It illuminated the quiet fault lines within the family itself. How they process emotion, how they define strength, how they interpret loyalty, not just to the crown, but to one another. The monarchy has always projected unity, but unity does not erase difference. And in that room, difference was palpable. Conversations that had long been postponed could no longer be ignored. The emotional language of the family was shifting, whether everyone was ready or not. William knew it, Catherine sensed it. Even those who preferred silence felt the inevitability of change pressing closer. Because once truth is spoken aloud, it cannot be unheard. And as whispers of the moment began to circulate beyond palace walls, the world was about to witness a very different monarchy. The monarchy thrives on perception. But what happens when a private moment threatens to redefine everything the public believes? As rumors of King Charles's emotional reaction began to surface, questions followed. Was this a moment of weakness or humanity? And could this single exchange between a grandfather and grandson reshape the image of the crown forever? It began, as these things often do, in whispers. A quiet account shared beyond the palace gates. A subtle confirmation that something unexpected had occurred. No official statement, no detailed explanation, just enough to ignite curiosity. In an age where information moves faster than tradition can contain it, even the suggestion of royal vulnerability becomes headline material. Commentators speculated, analysts dissected. The narrative machine roared to life. Some framed it as unprecedented fragility. A king overcome, a crack in the ceremonial armor. Others saw something radically different, a sovereign allowing himself to feel, to respond, not as an emblem of state, but as a grandfather confronted by truth. The debate was swift and intense, strength versus softness, authority versus authenticity. The monarchy has long relied on stoicism as proof of stability. Yet here was a story that hinted at tears, at hesitation, at visible emotion. Blick fascination grew not because of scandal, but because of sincerity. For decades, critics accused the royal family of being distant, unreachable, emotionally opaque. Now, suddenly, there was evidence, however subtle, of something human beneath the regalia. Social conversations shifted tone. Was this the beginning of a more relatable monarchy, or a dangerous erosion of mystique? Within palace corridors, strategy replaced surprise. Communications advisors moved carefully, balancing acknowledgement with restraint. They understood the risk of overexposure. Confirm too much, and the institution appears fragile. Deny too forcefully, and it seems cold. So the response was measured. Brief references to family warmth. Carefully chosen language about generational dialogue. Enough to suggest connection, not enough to invite scrutiny. The narrative was not denied, it was redirected. Meanwhile, curiosity around Prince Louis intensified. The young royal, once known primarily for playful public appearances, was now being discussed as something more symbolic. A voice of a new era. A child unafraid to ask what others avoid. Commentators pondered what this might mean for the monarchy's future. If the next generation grows up valuing emotional transparency, will the institution evolve with them? Or will it resist, clinging to tradition as its shield? Globally, the perception began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. In some corners, the story strengthened the crown's image, proof that even kings wrestle with feeling. that leadership need not be devoid of heart. In others, it stirred concern about instability, about what happens when personal vulnerability intersects with public responsibility. The monarchy, once defined by unwavering composure, was now being examined through a more intimate lens. And perhaps that is what made the moment so powerful. It did not dismantle the institutio. It did not trigger constitutional crisis, but it introduced nuance, complexity. It suggested that beneath centuries of ritual lies a family navigating grief, expectation, and generational change, just like any other, only under relentless scrutiny. The crown has survived by adapting carefully, often invisibly. This moment, small yet seismic, may represent another evolution not of power, but of perception. Because once the public glimpses humanity within monarchy, the relationship transforms, distance narrows, expectations shift, but beneath the headlines and speculation lies a deeper question, one that may define the future of the monarchy itself. For centuries, the monarchy has been shaped by tradition, but now, a new generation is quietly rewriting the rules. Prince Louis's question wasn't just a moment, it was a signal, a glimpse into a future where honesty may matter more than protocol, and emotional truth may outweigh royal duty. And if that future is coming, it may transform the monarchy in ways no one ever imagined. The royal family has always evolved, but slowly, carefully, almost imperceptibly. Abdications, wars, scandals, each crisis forced adaptation, yet the core remained unchanged, restraint above all. Now, however, the shift feels different. It is not being driven by political upheaval or public outrage. It is being shaped from within by children raised in a world that values openness over opacity. Prince Louis represents more than youthful curiosity. He embodies a generational recalibration of what leadership looks like. Unlike heirs of the past, this new royal generation is not growing up entirely behind emotional walls. William and Catherine have made deliberate choices, prioritizing mental health conversations, encouraging dialogue, allowing vulnerability to coexist with visibility. Their parenting reflects an awareness that legacy is not just about lay, it is about temperament. They understand that the monarchy's survival may depend less on mystique and more on relatability. Louis, in his innocence, has become a symbol of that shift. His question pierced through tradition not with rebellion, but with authenticity, and authenticity is powerful. It disarms hierarchy, it softens distance, it forces introspection. In asking what others might suppress, he unintentionally highlighted a truth the monarchy has long tiptoed around, that emotional connection is not a threat to strength. It may be its evolution. For King Charles, this realization may be both unsettling and liberating. He was shaped by a different era, molded by discipline that rarely allowed room for public vulnerability. Yet leadership is not static. If history has proven anything, it is that the crown adapts or risks irrelevance. Charles now stands at a crossroads. Preserve the familiar rigidity of the institution, or cautiously embrace a more human expression of authority. His visible emotion in that private moment suggests he may already be shifting, even if subtly. The monarchy itself finds itself suspended between two narratives, one rooted in grandeur, continuity, and ceremonial distance, the other emerging from empathy, transparency, and generational dialogue. These narratives need not cancel each other out, but reconciling them will require courage. The kind of courage that acknowledges imperfection without surrendering dignity. Around the world, monarchies have fallen when they fail to reflect the people they serve. The British Crown has endured because it understands timing, and perhaps this is another such moment, a turning point not marked by proclamation, but by reflection, by a child's question that illuminated the emotional architecture of an ancient institution. If Louis symbolizes change, William and Catherine represent its architects. Third, I are shaping a legacy that balances tradition with tenderness. They are raising children who are not only aware of their roles, but encouraged to question them thoughtfully. That balance between reverence for the past and readiness for the future may define the next chapter of royal identity, because identity is not only inherited, it is interpreted, and the younger generation seems prepared to interpret monarchy through a more personal lens. A lens where empathy is not hidden, where emotional intelligence strengthens leadership, rather than undermines it. If that philosophy takes root, the crown will not lose its authority, it may gain deeper resonance. And as history looks back on this moment, one question remains: was this the beginning of the monarchy's greatest transformation? In the grand timeline of the monarchy, countless events have shaped its legacy, but sometimes it's not wars, coronations, or scandals that leave the deepest mark. It's a single, unexpected moment. A question, a pause, a tear, and in that fleeting exchange between Prince Louis and King Charles, something shifted, something that may echo through generations yet to come. History often remembers spectacle. Crowds roaring, crowns placed, empires defended, yet the true turning points are quieter. They unfold in private rooms, in unguarded seconds when power meets humanity. What happened between grandfather and grandson was not recorded in official archives, yet its emotional weight rivals any state occasion, because in that instant the monarchy was not defined by ceremony, it was defined by truth. Charles' reaction will not be etched into stone monuments, but it may live far longer in collective memory. A king, shaped by restraint, visibly moved by the innocence of a child. That image alone challenges decades of expectation. For so long, leadership within the royal family has been equated with endurance, hold steady, reveal nothing, carry on. Yet here was endurance giving way to emotion, not weakness, not collapse, but acknowledgement, and acknowledgement changes things. Louis's question now stands as more than childhood curiosity. It has become symbolic, a quiet confrontation between inherited tradition and emerging honesty, a reminder that even institutions built on centuries of protocol are still inhabited by human beings who grieve, who regret, who reflect. When that humanity surfaces, even briefly, it reshapes perception. The monarchy's identity has always been a delicate balance between myth and reality. Too much distance, and it feels untouchable. Too much exposure, and it risks losing mystique. This moment nudged that balance towards something new. It suggested that vulnerability, when authentic, does not diminish authority, it deepens it. A sovereign who can feel may also be one who understands more fully the emotional landscape of the nation he serves. Public reaction revealed something profound. Instead of outrage or instability, there was curiosity, empathy, even admiration. In a world weary of polished facades, authenticity resonates. The image of a king, moved by his grandson's honesty, humanized an institution often accused of emotional detachment. It reminded people that behind every title stands a person navigating the same complexities as anyone else: family tension, generational change, the burden of expectation. Yet the true significance of that exchange may lie not in headlines, but in legacy. Louis represents a generation unafraid to ask difficult questions. William and Catherine are raising children within tradition, but not imprisoned by it. Charles, in allowing his composure to soften, signaled that adaptation is possible, even at the highest level. The monarchy now stands at an inflection point, suspended between its storied past and an uncertain but evolving future. Change does not always arrive with revolution. Sometimes it arrives as reflection, as a tear that cannot be fully contained, as a question that lingers long after the room falls silent. That lingering is what matters most, because once an institution confronts its emotional truth, it cannot entirely retreat into comfortable silence. What form this transformation will take remains unclear. Will the monarchy embrace greater openness, weaving vulnerability into its public identity, or will it retreat, reaffirming stoicism as its shield? The answer is not yet written, but something undeniable has begun: a subtle redefinition of strength, of legacy, of what it means to lead not just with authority, but with heart. Because sometimes the smallest voices ask the biggest questions, and those questions have the power to change everything. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.